The dust had not yet settled on the grave of Rose Harper's last mistake when a stranger rode into Redemption Creek, and everything she had spent 3 years trying to bury came rising up like floodwater in a dry canyon. It was the summer of 1878, deep in the hill country of Texas, where the sun beat down so hard on the cracked earth that mirages shimmered at the edge of every horizon, and men sometimes chased them for miles before realizing there was nothing there. Redemption Creek was a small town, no more than a few hundred souls pressed together by necessity rather than affection, the kind of place where everyone knew your name and most of them knew your shame. There was a general store run by old Morton Webb, a livery stable that smelled of horsehair and iron, a church that held services every Sunday whether the congregation wanted it or not, a sheriff's office with a perpetually broken window, and the Lucky Spur Saloon, where most of the real business of the town was conducted between sundown and midnight. Rose Harper worked in the Lucky Spur, but not in the way that people sometimes assumed, with the kind of quick judgment that small towns handed out like pennies. She waitressed tables, kept the books, and occasionally played the upright piano in the corner when the regular piano man was too drunk to find the keys. She was 26 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned up beneath a cotton bonnet when she worked the tables, and sharp green eyes that had a habit of looking right through people when they tried to charm her. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense that the dime novels described women, all soft and yielding. She was striking, the kind of woman who made a room take note, but there was a hardness around the edges of her that warned people not to get too comfortable. 3 years before, she had been married. His name was Colt Harper, and he had been everything that a man should not be wrapped in a package that looked like everything a woman wanted. He was handsome and bold, and he made her laugh like no one else ever had, and she had been 23 and certain that her instincts were good. They were not. Colt Harper had a gambling problem that ran deeper than any river in Texas, and he had a temper that he kept hidden until after the wedding, and he had a particular fondness for the kind of women who came with no complications and no feelings to consider. He had died 18 months into the marriage, shot by a card dealer in San Antonio over a debt he had no means to pay, and Rose had felt the grief and the relief at the same time, which had done something to her that she had never quite found the words for. The grief was for the man she had believed he was. The relief was for herself, and the guilt of that relief had settled inside her like a stone in still water, sitting heavy and immovable at the bottom of everything she did. She had come to Redemption Creek 6 months after that because she needed a new start, and because the town was far enough from San Antonio that no one would know her story unless she chose to tell it. She had not chosen to tell it. People filled in the gaps themselves, as people do, and the version most of them had settled on was close enough to the truth that she did not bother correcting it. She was a widow. She kept to herself. She worked hard. She did not entertain the attentions of any man who came through the Lucky Spur, and several had tried. The saloon owner, a broad-shouldered woman named Harriet Doyle, who wore her gray hair in a thick braid down her back, and ran the establishment with the kind of even-handed authority that most sheriffs only dreamed of, had taken Rose on without asking too many questions. Harriet had seen enough of the world to know that sometimes the best employees came from broken places, and Rose was the best she'd ever had. She was honest, quick with numbers, steady under pressure, and completely immune to being charmed by anyone who tried to underpay her or cut corners. The morning that Timothy Brooks rode into Redemption Creek was a Tuesday in late June, and the heat was extraordinary even for that time of year. Rose was sweeping the front steps of the Lucky Spur when she heard the slow clop of a horse coming down the main street from the north. She looked up from her sweeping the way anyone might look up at a sound, with the reflexive awareness that living in a frontier town instilled in a person, and she saw him. He was riding a roan quarter horse with a calm, easy gait that matched his own bearing exactly. He was tall in the saddle, with broad shoulders under a faded denim shirt, dark hair curling slightly at the ends where the sweat had gotten to it, and a hat pulled low enough that she could not immediately see his face. He had a bedroll and saddlebags that spoke of a man who traveled light by choice rather than poverty. He was not wearing a badge, which she noted, and he was not wearing the kind of flashy gear that the men who were trying to be something usually wore. Everything about him said practical and unhurried and confident in a way that did not need to announce itself. She went back to sweeping. He stopped his horse in front of the livery stable across the street and dismounted with the ease of a man who had been on horseback more than he had been off it. She watched him from under her bonnet brim without making it obvious she was watching. He spoke briefly to Sam Aldridge, the stable boy, patted the horse's neck with genuine affection, and then looked up and down the main street with the calm assessment of someone who was getting his bearings. His eyes found the lucky spur. They found her. She swept more deliberately. He crossed the street with an unhurried stride and stopped at the foot of the steps. Up close, she could see his face clearly now. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with the kind of tan that came from years under open sky rather than a single season, a jaw that carried a few days of dark stubble and brown eyes so warm that they almost startled her. There was nothing calculated in his expression. He was simply looking at her. "Morning," he said. His voice was low and even. "Morning," she said, and did not stop sweeping. "Is there a boarding house in this town? Somewhere a man can get a room and a decent meal?" "Mrs. Patterson's at the end of this street, second house past the church. She does breakfast and supper and her prices are fair." She paused. "She does not allow drinking on the premises." "Not much of a drinker," he said. "She also does not allow card playing." "I'm not much of a card player either." She glanced up at him briefly. "You'll get along fine then. Mrs. Patterson is a good woman." He nodded, touched the brim of his hat in the brief, courteous way that seemed natural rather than practiced, and said, "Thank you, ma'am." Then he went back across the street to collect his horse. Rose watched him go, and then realized she was watching him go, and went inside to start the coffee. His name was Timothy Brooks, and within 2 days the town knew the basics of him, because Redemption Creek was that size. He had come from north of Abilene, worked cattle ranching for most of his adult life, and had recently left a position on a large spread called the Crossbar Ranch after the owner's son had taken over management and changed the terms of every hired man's contract in ways that were, as Timothy put it when speaking to Morton Webb at the general store, not what anyone had agreed to. He was looking for honest work, had heard there were opportunities in the hill country, and had decided to see if it was true. He was quiet about his past beyond those basics, not because he had something to hide, but because he was, by nature, a man who did not feel the need to explain himself at length to people he had just met. He found work quickly enough. A rancher named Gerald Pickett had 300 head of cattle and not enough reliable men to manage them, and Timothy's references from the Crossbar Ranch were impeccable. He started on Thursday morning and was back in town by Saturday evening, and he ate supper at the Lucky Spur, where Rose brought him a bowl of Harriet's beef stew and a square of cornbread and a cup of coffee without being asked, because those were the things she brought everyone. "You always remember," he asked when she set the coffee down. She paused. "Remember what people want before they ask." She looked at him directly for the first time since the steps. "I pay attention," she said. "It's my job." "It's more than that," he said, without any flattery in it, just observation. "Most people don't pay that kind of attention even when it is their job." She did not have anything to say to that, so she moved to the next table. But she thought about it later. At home in the small room she rented from Mrs. Glenwood 2 streets over, lying on top of her quilt with the night breeze coming through the single window. She thought about the way he said things without any decoration, like they were simply true, and he saw no reason to dress them up differently. She had known men who used simple truth as a weapon, who wielded sincerity like a hook. She was very careful about those men. She was not sure yet which kind he was. The following weeks moved with the particular rhythm of a Texas summer, slow in the heat of the day and busy around the edges, morning and evening. Timothy Brooks came to the Lucky Spur for supper most evenings when he was not on the range with the picket cattle, and he was invariably polite and invariably tipped fairly and invariably spoke to Rose only when she lingered, which she did not, particularly. She kept the same professional warmth with him that she kept with everyone who was decent, and she kept the same careful distance. It was Harriet who noticed first, the way Harriet noticed most things. "That cowboy over in the corner has been here 7 evenings out of 9, Harriet said one night, after the crowd had thinned and Rose was tallying the ledger at the bar. "He's a regular." "Regulars are good for business," Rose said without looking up. "He watches you," Harriet said. "Lots of men watch the waitress. It doesn't mean anything." "Not like that, not the way some of them do." Harriet was quiet for a moment. "He watches you the way my Henry used to watch me, before I even knew he was watching." Rose looked up from the ledger. Harriet's husband Henry had died of a fever 12 years ago, and Harriet still spoke of him in the present tense sometimes, which Rose found simultaneously sad and beautiful. "Don't," she said quietly. "I'm just saying what I see. You see what you want to see. You're a romantic, Harriet." "I'm a realist who has been around long enough to know the difference." Harriet picked up a glass and polished it with the cloth she kept at her hip. "He's a good man, Rose. I have no opinion on that. You have opinions on everything. That's one of the things I like best about you." Rose closed the ledger with more firmness than was strictly necessary. "I made a very poor choice of opinion once before, and I have no intention of doing so again. Good night, Harriet." She walked home through the warm dark of the Texas night, and she thought, against her better instincts, that Harriet was probably not wrong about any of it, which was exactly the problem. The thing that changed the comfortable distance she had managed to maintain came on a Wednesday afternoon in late July, when the heat had reached the kind of extremity that made the air waver, and the town go quiet and still in the middle of the day. Rose was at the general store, picking up supplies, when she came out to find her small buckboard wagon listing badly to the right because a wheel had cracked under the heat and the weight, and had split down one side so badly that driving it was not possible. She stood looking at it with the particular exhaustion of someone for whom one more inconvenience feels like the last straw on a very tired back. She had 12 pounds of flour in that wagon and a bolt of cotton she had saved 3 weeks' tips to afford, and the wheelwright was in the next town over and not due back until Friday. "Miss Harper," she turned. Timothy Brooks was crossing the street from the direction of the livery stable, having apparently witnessed the whole thing from wherever he'd been standing. "Before you tell me you have it handled," he said, "I know you probably do. But I also happen to know how to fix a wheel, and I have the tools in my saddlebag because on a ranch you learn to carry what you need, and it would take me about 40 minutes. If you want the help." She looked at him. She looked at the wheel. She looked back at him. "I don't want charity," she said. "It's not charity, it's a neighbor fixing a wheel. People do it all the time. You're not my neighbor. I live 2 streets over from you at Mrs. Patterson's. That's close enough." He was already moving toward the wagon, crouching to examine the damage with the focused ease of a man who was comfortable with practical problems. "Yeah, this is fixable. It won't be pretty, but it'll hold. You have somewhere to be this afternoon." "I have to be at the Lucky Spur by 5. "It'll be done by 4. He straightened and looked at her. "You could go back inside, get a cold drink, wait in the shade, or you could stand here and oversee. Either way suits me." She stayed. She told herself it was because she did not trust anyone with her wagon who she couldn't watch, and that was partly true. She sat on the bench in front of the general store with a glass of water that Morton Webb brought out without being asked, and she watched Timothy Brooks work on her wheel with a concentration and a competence that was genuinely impressive. He worked without hurrying and without showing off, the way a man works when he knows what he is doing so well that it has ceased to require effort. He was done in 35 minutes. "There," he said, wiping his hands on a cloth. "It'll hold you until you can get to the wheelwright, but I'd not put too much weight on it for a long haul." "Thank you," she said, and meant it, which was unusual for her in situations where she had been helped against her preference. He put his tools away in his saddlebag and turned to go, and she heard herself say, "I'll have your supper on the house tonight." He looked back at her. There was something in his expression that she could not entirely categorize, warm and a little careful at the same time, as if he understood what it cost her to make that offer and was not going to press it. "That's not necessary," he said. "I know it isn't. That's why I offered it." She picked up her flower. 5 o'clock. Don't be late." He was not late. He came in at 5 minutes before 5 and sat at his usual table by the window, and when she brought him his stew and his cornbread and his coffee, he said thank you in that quiet, direct way of his, and she said you're welcome in the same tone, and the exchange between them was different from that evening forward in a way that was hard to explain but was unmistakable. They began to talk. Not at length, not with any kind of romantic intent on either side, at least not that either of them would have admitted. But she began to pause at his table for a moment or two when the other customers were settled, and he would ask her something small and genuine, not flattering questions, not questions designed to make her talk about herself so he could pretend to be interested. Genuine questions, the kind that came from actual curiosity. He asked about the piano in the corner and whether she played, and she said yes, and he asked what kind of music she preferred, and she said she liked hymns, and she liked the old folk songs her grandmother had taught her, and he said he had grown up with the same music, played on a fiddle by his father on winter evenings in a house in North Texas that was more gap than wall. He said it like it was a good memory, which she found interesting, because most people with that kind of childhood remembered the gap walls rather than the music. He asked once carefully about her life before Redemption Creek, and she gave him the abbreviated version, the same one she gave everyone: widow, needed a fresh start, found her way here. He accepted it without pressing, which was more than most people did. She found herself wondering with increasing frequency about the extended version, and whether she would ever trust anyone enough to give it. August came in with a thunderstorm that flooded the creek and turned the main street to mud for 3 days, and in the aftermath came a kind of softness to the air that made the evenings bearable. The town breathed easier. People sat on their porches again. Children played in the streets until dark. One such evening, Rose was walking home from the Lucky Spur at 9 o'clock, taking the longer route because the night air was fine, and she was not yet ready to be inside, when she came across the small community square where someone had built a low fire, and where 4 or 5 people from town were sitting and talking in the easy way of people who have survived a hard season together. Timothy was among them, sitting on a low fence post with a cup in his hand, and he saw her before she had decided whether to change her route. "Rose," he said, just her name, no particular inflection. She walked over. There was Gerald Pickett and his wife Ann, who was a kind woman with a broad laugh, and 2 young cowboys from the Pickett spread named Davis and Hector, and Harriet Doyle, who gave Rose a look so brief and so knowing that it was almost imperceptible. They sat and talked for an hour, all of them, about the flood and the cattle and the summer and the coming fall, and Rose sat on a barrel near the fire and found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did in company, because the conversation was easy and no one was performing for anyone else. Timothy said very little, but when he did speak, it was worth listening to. At one point, Harriet told the story of how she had started the Lucky Spur, which Rose had never heard in its entirety, how she had arrived in Redemption Creek with $20 and a wagon and a very clear idea of what she wanted to build, and how the bank had refused to lend her money because she was a woman, and how she had walked out of that bank and gone door to door to every business owner in town and borrowed $1 from each of them with a written promise to repay at reasonable interest, and had repaid every single one within 2 years. "The bank manager came in about a year after I opened," Harriet said, with great satisfaction, "and asked for a whiskey. I poured it myself, and I charged him exactly double what everyone else paid, and I told him why, and he paid it without a word. Everyone laughed, and Rose laughed too, genuinely. And when her laughter faded, she found Timothy looking at her with an expression that she felt rather than saw, something warm and quiet that he did not bother to look away from when she noticed it. She looked back at him for a moment, just a moment, and then she looked at the fire. The evening ended with the fire burning low and the company dispersing into the dark, and Rose found herself walking in the same direction as Timothy because they lived on the same side of town, and it would have been conspicuous to avoid it. They walked in silence for most of it, which was not uncomfortable. "You have a good laugh," he said at one point. "Most people have a laugh," she said. "Not like that. Most people laugh because they're supposed to. You laughed because you meant it." She thought about that. "I don't do things I don't mean," she said finally. "I know," he said. "I've noticed." They reached the point where their paths diverged, his toward Mrs. Patterson's and hers toward Mrs. Glenwood's, and he stopped and said good night the way he said everything, quietly and with complete sincerity. And she said good night back, and went home and sat in her room with the window open, and the night breeze on her face, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the particular ache of wanting something she was not sure she should have. She thought about Colt Harper. She thought about the way he had smiled at her across a room in San Antonio, just like this, just this feeling, wanting something she should reach for. She had reached and found a hand that closed too hard and would not let go. She pressed the feeling down and went to sleep. But feelings pressed down have a way of finding other exits. The following Sunday, Harriet closed the Lucky Spur for the afternoon, which she did twice a year in summer, and the whole town seemed to exhale and spread itself across the day in an unconstrained way that Rose usually found peaceful. She spent the morning writing letters she had been meaning to write for weeks, one to her sister Alina in Dallas, and one to a friend from before her marriage. And in the afternoon, she went to the creek with a book and sat on a flat rock in the shade of a cottonwood tree, and read, with the sound of the water moving slow and clear over the stones. She heard footsteps on the bank and looked up to find Timothy Brooks coming along the creek path with a fishing line coiled over one shoulder and his hat in his hand. He stopped when he saw her. "Sorry," he said. "I didn't know anyone was here." "It's a public creek," she said. "I'll find another spot." "You don't have to." She said it before she had finished deciding whether she meant it, and then because she had said it, she meant it. "The fish are better upstream. Sam Aldridge told me." He looked at her for a moment with that quiet attention of his. "All right," he said, and sat down on the bank about 10 feet upstream from her rock, and baited his line, and cast it into the water with the easy practice of a man who had done it many times. They were quiet for a long time. Rose read her book, or tried to, and the truth was she read the same 2 paragraphs 4 times without absorbing them, because she was aware of him in the way that she had been trying very hard not to be aware of him, a kind of steady warmth at the edge of her attention, like sitting near a fire. "Can I ask you something?" she said eventually. "Yes," he said, watching his line. "Why did you really leave Abilene?" "The thing about the contract terms, that's true, I'm sure, but men leave jobs for lots of reasons, and not all of them are what they first say." He was quiet for a moment, and she wondered if she had overstepped. Then he said, "My father died in January. He had a small piece of land up north of Abilene, just 40 acres, but it was his and he'd worked it for 30 years. Left it to me. I tried to work it myself for a few months, but 40 acres alone is hard going, and it was his dream more than mine. And every time I walked out to the fence line, I felt like I was living in a dream that belonged to someone else." He paused. "So I sold it to a young family who had been looking for something like it, and I packed up and rode south, and I told myself I'd know when I found the place I was supposed to be." "And have you?" she asked. He looked at her. "I'm still looking," he said, and smiled just slightly and went back to watching his line. She looked at the creek. The water moved over the stones and the cottonwood leaves made a sound like soft applause in the breeze. "My husband," she said, and stopped. She had not planned to say it. "He was not a good man. I thought he was when I married him. I was wrong." Timothy was very still, not tense, just listening. He died 18 months in, a card game gone bad. She kept her voice even, which was easier than she expected because she had said the factual version of this sentence many times, just not usually to anyone she particularly cared about. I came here after because I needed somewhere that wasn't full of his memory, and I have been very careful since then about what I let myself want. That's understandable, he said quietly. I'm telling you, she said, and had to stop again to find the exact words, because you have been kind to me in a way that I am not accustomed to, and I want to be honest with you before this becomes anything, so that you understand why I am the way I am, why I keep people at arm's length. He set his fishing line down carefully on the grass and turned to look at her fully. The afternoon light came through the cottonwood and fell across his face in pieces. Rose, he said, and the sound of her name in his voice was different from the way most people said it, careful and real. You don't owe me an explanation, not for any of it. I know I don't. That's why I'm giving you one. He looked at her for a long time and she looked back at him, and the creek went on making its sound between them. I'm not looking to fix you, he said. I don't think you need fixing. I think you're one of the most capable people I've ever met, and I think you're also one of the loneliest. And I don't say that to make you feel anything, I say it because I think it's true and I think you know it's true. The accuracy of it hit her somewhere deep. She pressed her lips together. I'm not in a hurry, he said. I'm not going anywhere. I found decent work in a town that seems honest and coffee that's better than what I've had in years. That's enough for now. He picked his fishing line back up. You don't have to be anything other than what you are. She looked at the creek for a long time after that. A fish rose to the surface and disturbed the water in a small bright circle and then was gone. You caught anything yet? She asked. Not a thing, he said cheerfully. Sam Aldridge was probably wrong about the fish. Probably, he agreed. But it's a nice afternoon anyway. She laughed, the real laugh, the one he had commented on, and he smiled at the creek, and she went back to her book, and this time she actually read it. September came, and with it, the first hints of cooler air at dawn and dusk, the kind of gentle transition that the Texas hill country offered when it was feeling generous. Rose played the piano at the Lucky Spur on Friday evenings when Harriet's regular man, Dooley Pierce, wanted the night off, and in September she played 3 Fridays in a row because Dooley had taken badly to a cold that turned into something worse, and Harriet paid her extra, which she did not ask for but was glad to have. Timothy came every Friday. He sat at the table nearest the piano rather than his usual table by the window, and he listened with the same quality of attention he gave to most things, complete and unperforming. After the second Friday, when she had finished playing and come to collect her things, he said, "You play like someone who learned because they loved it, not because someone made them." My grandmother, she said. She had a piano in the front room of her house in Austin, and every time I visited she let me play it as long as I wanted. Most people tell you to stop after 20 minutes. She sounds like a wise woman. She was the wisest person I ever knew. Rose buttoned her coat, autumn evenings being what they were. She died when I was 15. I've been trying to find someone as honest as she was ever since. Have you found anyone? She looked at him. Almost, she said, and walked out into the evening. She walked home fast, her heart going at a rate that was not appropriate to the pace of her feet, because she had said almost and she had meant him, and she had said it without deciding to, and it was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in 3 years, and it terrified her. A week later, Gerald Pickett's wife Anne came into the Lucky Spur for lunch and sat at the bar with Rose during the quiet middle hour, and talked with the comfortable frankness of a woman who liked Rose and did not stand on ceremony. Ann Pickett was 45 and had lived in this country her whole life and understood it in a way that only long acquaintance permits. "That man of ours, Timothy," Anne said, wrapping her hands around a mug. "He's worth something, Rose. I know Gerald can be hard to read, but Gerald says he's the best hired man he's had in a decade. Honest to a fault, works hard, doesn't complain, and he's good with the horses in a way that Gerald says you can't teach." "He seems competent," Rose said carefully. He asked Gerald about land, Anne said, whether there was anything reasonable in this part of the county, something of his own. Rose looked up from the glass she was polishing. Did he? He wants to put down roots, Anne said, without any particular inflection, looking at the mug. Seems he's found a place he likes. She looked up then and met Rose's eyes with a directness that was entirely deliberate. A place he likes very much. Rose put the glass down. Anne, I know I'm not meddling, I'm just saying what Gerald said, which is what Timothy said. Anne stood and put coins on the bar for her lunch. I think you're one of the best things in this town, Rose Harper. I think you deserve whatever good thing is standing in front of you. That's all I'm saying. She went out and the bell above the door chimed twice, and Rose stood behind the bar and felt the world shifting under her in a way that was frightening and was also, she could not deny it, like coming up for air after a very long time underwater. It was Harriet who found her standing there a few minutes later, still holding the same cloth and the same glass. "You all right?" Harriet asked. "I don't know," Rose said honestly. Harriet looked at her with the long, careful look she used when she was deciding something. Then she said, "Do you trust him?" Rose thought about it. Really thought about it the way she had been afraid to. She thought about the wheel and the fish and the piano and the almost and the patience he had shown her that no one had asked him to show her and that she had given him no particular reason to show her. She thought about the way he never pressed, never pushed, never tried to be something other than what he was. "Yes," she said, and was surprised to find that it was completely true. "Then maybe stop punishing him for what someone else did," Harriet said, without any harshness, and went into the kitchen. Rose stood there for another moment. Then she put the glass down, took off her apron, told the other waitress, a girl named Bess, that she would be back in 30 minutes, and walked out into the afternoon. She found him at the Pickett Ranch, which was 3 miles from town, and she knew because Anne had mentioned it without appearing to that Timothy spent Tuesday afternoons repairing fence on the east pasture. She borrowed one of Harriet's horses, who was a steady gray mare named Pudding that Rose had ridden before, and she rode out to the east pasture fence line and found Timothy Brooks exactly where she expected to, driving posts into the earth with a methodical strength that was easy to watch. He heard the horse and turned. When he saw who it was, surprise moved across his face and then settled into something quieter. She dismounted and tied Pudding to the nearest post that was already secure and walked toward him across the dry grass, and he set his tools down and waited. She stopped about 3 feet from him, which was close enough for honesty and far enough for safety. "I'm not good at this," she said. "I want you to know that from the start." "All right," he said. "I don't trust easily. I am stubborn. I keep my own counsel, and I don't change my mind easily, and I will argue with you when I think you're wrong. Those all sound like reasonable qualities in a person," he said. "I'm telling you the difficult parts first. I appreciate that." She took a breath. "I have spent 3 years being very careful not to want anything that could disappoint me again, and I am telling you that it has not worked especially well, because I am still standing in a field on a Tuesday afternoon saying things I did not plan to say, which means that wanting something got through anyway, despite everything." He looked at her with those warm brown eyes that she had been carefully not drowning in for weeks. "What did it get through?" he said softly. "I would very much like you to court me," she said, "if that is what you want. And I want you to understand that it will be slow, and I may pull back sometimes, and that is not about you. And I want you to understand that I have been very wrong about a man before, and I am frightened of being wrong again." He was quiet for a moment that felt long. Then he said, "Rose, I have been waiting for you to say something like that since the second week I was in this town. I am not going anywhere. I am not going to rush you, and I am not going to be anyone other than who I am." "How do I know that?" she asked, because she had to ask it. "You don't," he said simply. "Not yet, but you will," she nodded. She looked at the fence line and at the blue sky above the pasture and at the horses grazing in the far distance. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. She untied Pudding and mounted and rode back toward town, and she did not look back, but she was smiling, and the smile felt strange on her face. The way a familiar thing feels strange when you have been away from it for a long time. He called on her the following Saturday evening, formally, with his hat in his hand, at Mrs. Glenwood's boarding house, and Mrs. Glenwood, who was 70, and had the discretion of someone who had survived a great deal of other people's business, let them use the front parlor for an hour where it was proper, and also left a plate of molasses cookies on the side table, and did not comment on how many were gone when she collected the plate. They talked for 2 hours. The conversation moved between easy and serious in the natural way of people who are genuinely interested in each other. He told her more about growing up in North Texas with his father, a quiet man who had taught him to read by firelight, and had believed that a man's worth was measured entirely by how he treated people with nothing to offer him. He told her about his years on the cattle drives, the Kishom Trail twice, and what it did to a man to sleep under stars for months and then try to be comfortable in rooms. He told her about a horse he had loved with the particular devotion that some men give to horses that he had lost to a snake bite in the summer of '76, and had grieved more than some people. She told him about her grandmother's piano. She told him about learning to keep the books at her uncle's dry goods store in Austin when she was 16, because he could see she was quick with numbers and thought it was more useful than embroidery. She told him about meeting Colt Harper at a summer dance, the full version, not the abbreviated one, and what the marriage had been because she had decided, on the ride home from the pasture, that she was not going to give anyone only the safe version of herself again. If it frightened him away, better to know it now. It did not frighten him away. He listened to the whole of it with an attention that felt like care, not pity, which was the distinction that mattered most to her. When she was done, he said, "You survived something that would have broken a lot of people." "I don't know about that," she said. "I do," he said. She looked at her hands in her lap. "You should know," she said, "that I sometimes feel guilty for being relieved when he died. Is that a terrible thing to feel?" "No," he said without hesitation. "No, it is not. You were relieved because you were safe and you had not been safe. That is not a terrible feeling. That is an honest one." The relief she felt at hearing that, at having it named without judgment, was so acute that she had to look away for a moment and breathe carefully. He gave her that moment without filling it. Autumn proper arrived, and with it a rhythm to the courtship that felt right, not rushed, not overly formal but steady. He called on her Saturday evenings in the parlor, and they walked on Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted, out along the creek path where she had seen him fishing, or through the edge of town where the live oaks grew, where the land was quiet and the sky went on forever. They talked about everything with the freedom of people who have decided to be honest with each other, and found that honesty is actually a relief rather than a weight. He brought her wildflowers once, and she put them in a tin cup on her windowsill and looked at them every morning for as long as they lasted. He never mentioned it again or made it into anything, which was exactly the right thing. She played the piano for him one evening just for him, when the Lucky Spur was closed on a Thursday evening, and Harriet gave them the key and the excuse of Rose practicing for Friday's set. She played the folk songs her grandmother had taught her, and the hymns she knew by heart, and one piece she had composed herself over the course of a summer 2 years ago that she had never played for anyone. When she finished that last one, there was silence, and then he said, "That's yours, isn't it? You wrote that." "Yes," she said. "It's beautiful," he said. "It sounds like something that knows what it is." She turned on the bench and looked at him, sitting in one of the bar chairs with his hat on his knee, and she thought about what Harriet had said about her Henry, that he had watched her the way Timothy watched Rose, and she thought about her grandmother and about the 40 acres that had belonged to someone else's dream and about the way certain things take exactly as long as they need to take before they are right. "Timothy," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am glad you came to this town." "So am I," he said. He held her gaze steadily. "I am very glad." She reached over and played one more song, something light and quick, just to do something with her hands, and he stayed until it was fully dark outside, and then walked her home through the live oak streets of Redemption Creek with the stars brilliant above them and the night warm and soft as anything. At the gate to Mrs. Glenwood's, he stopped. He stood with his hat in his hands and looked at her with a directness that was different from his usual directness, something in it more open. "I want to say something to you," he said, "and I want you to know I'm saying it because it's true, not because I think it's what you want to hear." She waited. "I have been in this town 5 months," he said, "and every day of those 5 months I have found you to be the most remarkable person I have ever been in the same room with. You are honest and capable, and you are kind in ways you don't give yourself credit for, and you are more resilient than you seem to know. And I am not saying any of this to charm you. I am saying it because you told me once that your grandmother was the most honest person you'd ever known, and you've been trying to find someone that honest ever since. I am trying to be that. I am trying to be worth finding." She stood at the gate with the starlight on her face and felt something in her chest open in the way that a window opens on a spring morning, not with drama, but with the simple, quiet fact of fresh air coming in. "You are," she said, and it was the simplest thing she had ever said to anyone and also the most enormous. He smiled, and it was a full smile, the kind she had not seen from him in full before, and it changed his whole face into something warm and unguarded, and she thought she could look at that smile for a very long time without ever wanting to look away. "Good night, Rose," he said. "Good night, Timothy," she said. She went inside. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a long time before she remembered to take off her coat. November came in with cold winds and pale skies, and the town pulled inward the way frontier towns do in the cold, spending more time around fires and inside walls, the warmth of human company more necessary when the weather was ungenerous. Rose found that the cold evenings at the Lucky Spur were livelier than the summer ones, people staying longer because outside was less appealing, and she was busier, which she did not mind. Timothy came most evenings, and he often brought something small when she was on her way home after closing, falling into step beside her with a lantern because the November nights were full dark by 8. He never announced it as an intention. He was simply there, and she had stopped pretending that she did not find it a comfort. One evening near the end of November, he walked beside her and said, with the particular tone he used for things that mattered, "I found some land." She looked at him. "About 4 miles northeast of the picket spread. 28 acres with a spring-fed water source and a small structure, more of a shack than a house, but the bones of it are good and the land is good. A man named Greer owned it and is selling because he's moving back east to be near his children." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been saving since I came here. I have enough for the land. The house would take some time." "That's wonderful news," she said, and meant it with her whole heart. "I wanted you to know," he said, "because I wanted you to understand that I am not a man without a plan. I am not floating here, waiting to see what happens. I know what I want and I am building toward it." The implication was clear and she did not misread it. She did not respond to the implication directly, not because she disagreed with it, but because there was still a step that had not been taken, a question that had not been asked, and she believed in things being done in their proper order. "Will you show me the land?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Saturday if the weather holds." The weather held just barely, with a thin winter sun and a north wind that made them ride fast to stay warm. She went on putting and he went on his roan, which he had named Jericho, and they rode the 4 miles to the northeast and came over a low rise, and she saw the land spread out below them, golden brown grass and a line of trees where the spring ran, and the small weathered structure that was more ambition than house but had a solidity to it that she could see even from the rise. "Well," she said, looking out over it. "It's not much to look at yet," he said. "No," she agreed. "But the water is good and the soil looks good, and that is a decent timber stand along the east edge, which means building material." She looked at him. "It's a fine piece of land, Timothy." "You can see what it could be," he said, and it was not quite a question. "I can see exactly what it could be," she said. They rode down to the spring and dismounted and drank the water, which was cold and clean. And she walked the perimeter of the small structure and looked at the bones of it with the appraising eye of someone who knew her practical limits and was realistic about them, and decided that it was fixable more than fixable. It was the beginning of something real. She stood in the cold winter light on the land that was not yet his but was going to be, and she felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for 3 years, a quiet click of recognition, the way a key sounds in a lock it was made for. December came. He bought the land on a Monday and rode to town on his lunch break to tell her, and she was behind the bar doing the morning accounts, and she looked up when he came in with snow in his hair and his eyes bright from the cold and the occasion, and she laughed at the sight of him and said congratulations, and he said thank you, and looked at her with so much in his expression that there was no longer any point in either of them pretending about any of it. "Rose," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that there is no pressure and there is no hurry, and if the answer is not yet, I understand that completely." Her heart was doing that thing it had been doing since September, the quick steady beat that was not fear, though it lived in the same part of the chest. "All right," she said. "Would you marry me?" he said. "Not right now, not next week, whenever you are ready, which might be a long time from now, and that is all right. But I want you to know that when the time is right for you, I want you to be my wife. I want to build that house with you, and I want to grow old on that land with you, and I want to hear you play the piano every evening until I am too old to hear anything. That is what I want, and I thought you should know." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked down at the ledger, and then she looked back at him. "Rose Harper," she said, not to him but out loud to the air as if she were talking to herself, "you have spent 3 years convincing yourself you do not deserve someone who treats you well. That is a long time to be wrong about yourself." He waited. He was very good at waiting. "I told myself for a long time," she said, looking at him now, "that I did not deserve a good man. That I had made too many mistakes and that I was too difficult and too guarded and too far from being the sort of woman who warranted that kind of care." She stopped. "I was lying to myself. I know that now. But I want you to know that you were not something I went looking for. You were something I had to be convinced to believe in, and I have believed in you for a while now, even when I was trying not to." "I know," he said softly. "That is exactly why I came," he had said to her, months later when they were talking about that conversation, when they were lying in the quiet of the house they had built together and looking back at the long road to that moment. She had asked him what had made him stay, when she had been so difficult, when she had kept him at such careful distance for so long. And he had said it simply and without any ceremony, "Because you told me without exactly saying it that you did not believe you deserved something good, and that is exactly why I came, not to prove you wrong but to be there when you were ready to prove it yourself." But that was later. In the moment in December with snow in his hair and the morning light coming through the Lucky Spur windows, she said, "Yes, Timothy, I will marry you, not this week, but yes." He breathed and she realized he had been holding it. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't thank me," she said. "Thank your father for teaching you to be what you are." He smiled, and it was the full one again, the unguarded one, and she came out from behind the bar and reached up and took the snow from his hair with her hand, which was the first time she had touched him like that, simply and without thinking, and his whole face changed when she did it. She left her hand there for a moment. "Now go back to work," she said. "Picket will dock your pay." "Worth it," he said, and went. Harriet came in 20 minutes later and found Rose at the bar with the accounts open, and her face doing something that Harriet recognized immediately. "Well," Harriet said. "I said yes," Rose said. Harriet sat down on the nearest stool and looked at her with an expression that was not complicated. "Good," she said. "Good for you, Rose Harper. Good for you." They were married in March, when the first green things were coming back to the hill country and the creek was running clear, and the air smelled of cedar and wet earth. It was a small wedding, because Rose preferred it and because the town, for all its nosiness, seemed to understand that this was not a public occasion, but a private one that the public was permitted to attend. The ceremony was in the church, performed by Reverend Marsh, who was brief and sincere, which was what Rose had asked for when she spoke to him in February. Anne and Gerald Pickett were there. Harriet Doyle stood up with Rose and wore her best dress, which was the same dark green wool she had been wearing to everything important for 20 years, and she looked magnificent. Sam Aldridge from the livery stable came, and Morton Webb from the general store, and Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house, and Mrs. Glenwood from the boarding house, and a handful of the Cowboys from the picket spread, and Dooley Pierce, who had recovered from his illness and came partly in support, and partly because there was food afterward, and he had a reliable interest in food. Rose wore her grandmother's locket and a dress she and Ann Pickett had made from blue wool, simple and well-fitted without any fuss, because that was the kind of woman she was and the kind of wedding she wanted. She walked down the aisle of the church without anyone on her arm, because she had walked on her own for 3 years, and she thought it was right to bring that person, that self-sufficient, difficult, independent woman, into the marriage as herself and not on loan from someone else. Timothy was waiting at the front of the church in a dark coat he had bought in Fredericksburg with money set aside specifically for the occasion, and he looked at her coming down that aisle the way she thought people looked in the stories, with everything visible on his face, love and wonder, and the plain gladness of a man who has waited for the right thing and is watching it arrive. She stood beside him at the front of the church and looked at him, and he looked at her, and Reverend Marsh said the words, and they said the words, and when it was done, Timothy took her hand with a gentleness that she had become accustomed to without ever having taken it for granted, and they turned to face the town of Redemption Creek together. The reception was at the Lucky Spur, where Harriet had outdone herself with food, and where Dooley Pierce played the piano with both enthusiasm and competence, and where people danced and ate, and the evening was warm despite the March air outside. Rose danced with Timothy, which she had not done with anyone since before her first marriage, and she found that dancing with a man she trusted was an entirely different thing from dancing with a man who made her tense. It was easy. It was actually easy, and she thought about how strange it was that the same motion could feel so different depending on who you were doing it with. "Are you happy?" he said against her hair as they moved slowly through the last dance of the evening. "Yes," she said simply, because she was. They moved into the house on the northeast land at the beginning of April. The building had taken all of January and February and part of March, with Timothy doing most of the work himself, and with help from Gerald Pickett and the Cowboys on weekends, and from a carpenter in town named Cooper Haynes, who said of Timothy, "A man who listens when you show him how to do something is rare. Most men think they already know." The house was not large, but it was solid. 2 rooms, a proper fireplace, a covered porch that faced east, good shutters on every window, a kitchen that was bigger than the bedroom because Rose had been asked what she wanted and had said, firmly, a proper kitchen. She planted a kitchen garden in April with seeds Morton Webb had ordered in for her. She kept the books for the Lucky Spur 2 mornings a week, which Harriet refused to have her stop doing and which Rose did not want to stop, because she liked the numbers and she liked the 2 mornings a week at Harriet's bar with coffee and quiet work. Timothy worked the Pickett cattle through the spring and also began the slower work of developing his own 28 acres, which would take years, but which he approached with the same patience he applied to everything. They had a life. A real, specific, day-by-day life, with mornings and evenings and arguments about small things and the easy companionship of people who have chosen each other with eyes open. Their first argument was about the fence line, which Timothy wanted to put along the east edge of the property and Rose thought should go further east to leave room for the timber stand to be accessed from both sides. She was right, and he eventually agreed, though it took 2 evenings of discussion to get there, and afterward he said, "I told you I'd argue with you when I thought you were wrong." "I know," she said. "I am the one who said it first." "Well," he said, I want the record to show that I argued in good faith. The record shows that you came around eventually, she said. That is also good faith, he said. And she laughed, and he put a log on the fire, and they read the rest of the evening in the comfortable quiet of people who have already said what needed saying. Summer again, and the Texas heat, familiar now in the context of this house and this land. The way familiar things change their character depending on where you stand when you experience them. Rose had her garden producing beans and squash and tomatoes and peppers, more than 2 people could eat. So she put up preserves and took surplus to Harriet, who used them at the lucky spur and refused to not pay her for them, which was the kind of argument Rose always lost because Harriet was as stubborn as she was. She was expecting a child by August, which they had not planned for any particular timeline but which she felt, when the doctor in Fredericksburg confirmed it in July, a quiet and enormous joy that was different from any joy she had experienced before. Timothy's face when she told him on the porch of the house in the evening with the last light orange on the eastern hills was the thing she thought she would remember longest, not the words he said, though the words were good, but the look, which was the look of a man for whom something enormous has just become real. "A baby," he said for the 3rd time. "Yes," she said for the 3rd time. "Our baby," he said. "That is generally how it works," she said, and he laughed, the full laugh she had first heard months ago around Harriet's fire, and pulled her gently close, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the solid warmth of him and the solid warmth of the summer evening, and thought about her grandmother's piano and the folk songs learned by heart and the stone in still water and how water, if you give it enough time, will eventually move the stone. Their son was born in February of 1880, on a cold night with the wind from the north and the fireplace throwing good light across the bedroom. The midwife, Mrs. Calloway from town, was matter-of-fact and competent and kept the whole proceedings as calm as such proceedings can be kept. Timothy was there, which was not usual for the time but which Rose had stated clearly was what she wanted, and he stayed and held her hand when she asked him to and stayed back when she did not and did not say anything that was unhelpful, which was a more considerable achievement than it might sound. The baby came just before midnight, healthy and loud and immediately opinionated about the state of things, and the midwife said, "A boy," and Rose looked at her son and felt the world rearrange itself into a configuration she had not known was possible. "What is his name?" Mrs. Calloway asked. Rose looked at Timothy, who was looking at the baby with the expression of a man who has been completely and permanently changed by a single sight. "James," Rose said. "James Henry Brooks." Henry for Harriet's husband, because Harriet had held her up through the years before Timothy, and that deserved acknowledging. James because it was her grandfather's name, and because it was a good solid name that would hold a person up. "James," Timothy said, and his voice was not entirely steady, which she loved him for. Harriet Doyle, when she heard the name the following morning, sat down on her stool behind the bar and was quiet for a full minute, which was the longest Rose had ever seen her be quiet, and then she said, "You named that child after my Henry." "I did," Rose said. Harriet looked at the bar top. "That is," she said, "the finest thing anyone has ever done for me." She looked up and her eyes were bright. "You know I am going to completely spoil that boy." "I was counting on it," Rose said. The years in Redemption Creek after James's birth had a particular quality that Rose would have found difficult to describe to her younger self, the version of herself who had stood outside the Lucky Spur with a broom on a summer morning in 1878. They were not easy years. Frontier life in Texas did not do easy in any sustained way. There were hard winters and a drought summer that tested the ranch and the garden and every plan they had made. And there was the ordinary difficulty of a life lived at close quarters with another person, whose stubbornness and certainty sometimes collided with her own. But they were good years, truly good, in the way that only things built with care and honesty and 2 people who meant what they said to each other can be good. Timothy had, by 1882, expanded the ranch to 40 acres, purchasing the adjacent parcel from an elderly couple who were moving north to be near their daughter, and he had shifted gradually from working the picket cattle to managing his own small herd, building it slowly and carefully, the way he did everything. Rose still kept the Lucky Spurs books on those 2 mornings a week, and when Harriet's eyesight began to trouble her in the winter of 1882, Rose took over more of the management, which led to a conversation in which Harriet said, "I want you to have this business when I am gone." "You are not going anywhere," Rose said. "Eventually I am," Harriet said, with complete equanimity. "And I have no children and no family closer than a cousin in Ohio who has never been west of the Mississippi. I want this to go to someone who understands it and loves it. That is you." She paused. "I am not dying today, but it will happen someday and I want it to be settled." Rose sat with that for a long moment. "I need to talk to Timothy," she said. "Of course you do," Harriet said. "And he will say yes because he is a sensible man and because he knows what this place means to you." He said yes. He said more than yes. He sat with Rose on the porch that evening while James slept and talked through every aspect of it with the seriousness it deserved, what it would mean for the household, how they would manage the books alongside the ranch work, whether they would need to hire additional help at the saloon. He asked the right questions and offered his honest thoughts and at the end said, "You built something here, Rose, before me, before us. That place is part of your story and Harriet trusting you with it is one of the finest things I've heard." She looked at him in the evening light, this man who had ridden into her town on a roan horse on a summer Tuesday and had stayed and had built and had been, without fail, without a single deviation, exactly what he had said he was. "I did not deserve you," she said, and it was not the same statement it would have been 3 years before. It was not self-diminishment. It was wonder. "You told me that almost," he said. "Before you let me in, I could see it in you, that belief that you had forfeited something by what you'd been through." "You saw right through me," she said. "I saw you," he said. "That's different from seeing through you." She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked out at the land, their land, the spring line of trees dark against the last light, the cattle dim shapes in the far field, the kitchen garden running along the south side of the house in neat rows that would need watering in the morning. James would be 3 in February, and he was the most determined small person she had ever encountered, already following his father around the property with a seriousness of purpose that made both of them laugh, already demanding to know the name of every animal and every tool and every plant in the garden with an appetite for information that Rose recognized as entirely her own. "I want another one," she said. Timothy was quiet for a moment. "Another what?" "Baby," she said. "Oh," he said. And then warmly, "Yes, I want that too." Their daughter was born in 1884 in the spring, and they named her Clara Grace. Clara for the sheer sound of it and Grace, because it seemed like the right word for what they had been given. She came into the world quieter than James, but no less certain of herself, and from the very first months of her life had a quality of watchfulness that Rose recognized as her own and found moving in a way she had not anticipated, seeing herself mirrored back in a small face that also had Timothy's eyes. Harriet Doyle came to see the baby on the 3rd day and held Clara with the practiced ease of a woman who had held a great many babies belonging to other people, and said, "Well, Clara Grace, you have come into the finest family in this county, and I want you to know that I intend to be very good to you and that I have already put your name in my books." "Harriet," Rose said. "Hush," Harriet said, not looking up from the baby. "Let an old woman enjoy this." The Lucky Spur changed hands formally in 1886, when Harriet was 71 and her eyesight had deteriorated to the point that she could no longer run the bar without assistance, and she retired to a smaller house on the edge of town that Rose and Timothy helped her set up, with a good rocking chair and a south-facing window, and where Harriet received visitors with the grace of a woman who had always known how to be comfortable in herself, regardless of circumstances. Rose ran the Lucky Spur with the same hands-on steadiness Harriet had always used, keeping Dooley Pierce for the music and Bess, now 24 and reliably capable, for the waitressing, and hiring a young man named Cal to tend bar and do the heavy work. She still kept the books herself. She would always keep the books herself. The town of Redemption Creek had grown somewhat by the latter part of the 1880s, the railroad having come through 20 miles south and brought with it a modest increase in commerce and a modest increase in the kind of trouble that commerce sometimes brings. There was a better school by then, which James attended with the intensity he brought to everything, and which Clara joined at the appropriate age with a rather more sociable approach to the institution. Rose was part of the town committee that advocated for a properly paid schoolteacher rather than the rotating arrangement of whoever was available, which had characterized the school's first years, and she was effective on that committee in the way she was effective at most things, clear and direct, and not willing to accept false economy as an argument. Timothy served on the same committee and on the water board, and was generally regarded as one of the more trustworthy men in the county, which was a reputation he had earned without seeking it, the kind of reputation that accrues to people who do what they say they will do, consistently, and without requiring recognition for it. Gerald Pickett had made him a partner in the expanded spread by 1885, which was both a financial arrangement and an acknowledgement, and the two ranches operated in close cooperation. There were seasons that tested them. The drought year of 1886, when the spring ran low and the cattle needed moving and the garden barely produced, was hard in a sustained way that wore at the edges. There was a winter when James was sick with a chest illness that frightened both of them in the deep, wordless way that parental fear is its own category of experience, and which resolved after 3 weeks into recovery, but which left Rose shaken in a way she did not entirely disguise. There was the fire that took the east fence line and the timber structure at the border of the property in the summer of 1887, a grass fire from a neighbor's careless campfire that was out before it reached the house, but took the timber building and a section of fence and half a summer's work, and which Timothy walked through the following morning with a quietness that she knew was how he contained himself when things were genuinely hard. She walked with him that morning through the blackened grass and the smell of the burned timber, and she took his hand without saying anything, and he held it for a long time as they walked, and eventually he said, "We will rebuild it." "Of course we will," she said. "The timber stand will come back in a few years." "I know. It could have been much worse." "It could have," she agreed and pressed his hand, and they walked the rest of the circuit in silence that was not empty but full of all the things that did not need to be said because they were already understood. They rebuilt the timber structure that fall. They always rebuilt. It was the spring of 1889 when Harriet Doyle died, quietly in her south-facing chair, on a Tuesday morning in April. Mrs. Patterson, who checked on her daily, found her with her hands folded in her lap and the window open and the morning light coming in, and said afterward that she looked entirely peaceful, which Rose believed because Harriet had always been exactly who she was and had no unfinished business with the world. Rose cried in a way she had not cried in a very long time, and she was not ashamed of it. She stood in Harriet's small sitting room with Timothy's arm around her and his hand at the back of her head, and she grieved the woman who had given her work without asking hard questions, and who had pushed her when she needed pushing, and who had named her son's middle name with the steadiness of someone who considered it their responsibility to hold people up. "She was the first person here who believed in me," Rose said, when she could speak evenly, "before I had given anyone much reason to." "That's what the best people do," Timothy said. They buried Harriet Doyle in the Redemption Creek churchyard with more of the town present than had been there for most of the funerals Rose had witnessed, because Harriet had touched a great many lives in 20 years, and the town knew it. Reverend Marsh gave a eulogy that was, for once, exactly right, speaking about the particular kind of courage it took to build something from nothing, and to do it with generosity rather than grasping. Rose played the piano at the reception afterward, the old hymns and the folk songs, and she played them without decoration, the way her grandmother had taught her, clean and from the heart, and there was not a dry eye in the lucky spur by the time she was finished. She looked up from the keys and found Timothy leaning against the bar with his arms crossed and his eyes on her, and she smiled at him, small and true, and he smiled back the same way. Life continued. James grew into a young man of 16 by 1895, who was serious about cattle management and deeply curious about everything, and who had inherited his father's patience and his mother's directness in a combination that made him both easy to underestimate and impossible to manage, which Rose considered an excellent start for a person. Clara, at 11, was the social center of her school class, and spent her afternoons either at the Lucky Spur watching Rose run the business with an interest that seemed professional rather than childlike, or on horseback with her father, who had taught both children to ride before they could properly read. The Lucky Spur was prosperous by the mid-1890s, not extravagantly so but sustainably so, and Rose had by that point repaid the town in ways she could count, and in ways she could not. She had extended credit to 3 families during hard years, and forgiven one debt outright when the family lost their patriarch in a ranching accident, and she had hired a young woman named Mabel who had come to town in difficult circumstances and had no references but quick eyes and honest hands, because someone had done that for her once and she had not forgotten it. The ranch was solid. The garden was extensive. The house had grown 2 additional rooms over the years, the children needing more space as they grew and Timothy and Rose needing, occasionally, a room where the door could be closed against the noise of family life. The east timber stand had come back beautifully, just as Timothy had said it would. It was an evening in the early summer of 1895, a warm and clear-skied evening of the kind that the Texas Hill country produced like a gift in June, and they were on the porch after supper with the children inside doing their respective evening occupations, James at the table with a book on land management, and Clara at the small piano they had bought for her 3 years ago, when it became clear that she had her mother's ear and her mother's love for the instrument. Clara was playing one of the folk songs, slowly and carefully, working out the notes by ear the way Rose had taught her, and the sound came through the open window and into the evening like something perfectly placed. Timothy sat beside Rose on the porch in the way they sat on evenings like this, her shoulder against his arm, his hand easy over hers on the armrest, the roan Jericho long since gone and a newer horse in the pasture, the fields quiet and the first stars showing in the east. "Rose," he said. "Timothy," she said, "are you happy?" It was the question he had asked her on their wedding night, dancing in the Lucky Spur with Dooley at the piano, and she had said yes and meant it completely, and it had turned out to be the beginning of something rather than the end of something, which was not always how happiness worked. She looked out at their land, the spring line of trees, the cattle settling for the night, the kitchen garden that she had planted and replanted every spring for 15 years, the fence line that Timothy had argued about and then conceded and was now exactly right. She listened to her daughter playing the folk songs that had come down from a grandmother Rose had loved and lost and now carried forward in this form, through Clara's careful hands on the keys. She thought about a stone in still water and how water moves the stone if you give it time. "Yes," she said, "entirely." He turned his hand under hers and she curled her fingers through his, and they sat together on the porch in the summer evening listening to Clara play until the stars were out in full, and the night was warm around them and there was nothing unresolved, nothing undone, nothing waiting to be said that had not already been said. Inside, James looked up from his book and listened to his sister play, and heard his parents on the porch talking quietly, the particular back and forth of 2 people who have spoken to each other so often, and with such honesty that even their silences are a kind of conversation. And he returned to his book with the uncomplicated satisfaction of a young man who has grown up in a house where love was not performed but practiced, daily and deliberately. and who has therefore absorbed it into himself without having to work at it. Clara finished the song and started it again from the beginning, because the beginning had not been quite right, and she wanted it to be right, because that was the way her mother had taught her. On the porch, Rose leaned her head against Timothy's shoulder, and the stars went on appearing one by one in the Texas sky above Redemption Creek, and the spring ran clear at the east edge of the land, and the wind came soft from the south, and everything was, in the fullest sense of the word, exactly as it should be. She had told him, without quite saying it, that she did not deserve a good man. And he had come and he had stayed and he had built and he had loved her, not in spite of who she was but entirely because of it. The difficult parts and the careful parts and the resilient parts and the honest parts, all of it, all of her. And she had grown into the kind of woman who could hold that without apology or wonder, just with gratitude and with the quiet, unshakable knowledge that some things, when they are right, feel like coming home. And this was home, all of it, all of them. For all the years that remained, and there were many, the ranch grew and the children grew, and the lucky spur kept its warm light burning at the center of Redemption Creek. And Rose Harper Brooks played the piano on Friday evenings when she felt like it, which was most Fridays. And Timothy Brooks sat at the table nearest the piano and listened to every note with the same attention he had given her since the very beginning, complete and unperforming and entirely, unreservedly there.